Well, Subhana, thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
First question. Do you think the outer environment is a reflection of humanity's inner psychological environment? And what can be done to help people be more psychologically and emotionally sustainable so we treat nature in a more sustainable way? Fashion?
Well, yes, I do think that the outer environment is a reflection of our inner psychological, emotional and behavioural aspects of human beings, particularly our economic, political and social systems that we've created. Those are a reflection of our beliefs, our thoughts, our feelings, our attitudes, our ideas and opinions. All of that, we've created those systems. So if we have a problem with those systems, it's really important that we look a little bit deeper into our thoughts, our attitudes, our beliefs, the mind and heart, because otherwise if we will recreate the same old political, social, environmental problems all over again. We'll keep repeating that until we look deeper inside of ourselves for, some transformation. Transformation on the outer sense in the environment has to also equally occur from transformation from within. They're interrelated.
Other things we judge in others, a mirror of something we judge within ourselves, and what defines a critical judgment between a statement of fact or a diagnosis? And how do we know when we're pointing the finger that's pointing back at us, or we're just making a diagnosis like a doctor does?
Critical judgments, I think we have to be very mindful of critical judgments that we have about other people, and they're not just, are we mindful that they are our own opinion, our own judgment, our belief, our thinking, and not all critical judgments are a fact about how another person is, or they're not necessarily true, real, and a fact. They are a judgment. And yes, a doctor has to be asked to make an assessment, a judgment, their best judgment. But that's done in a kind of clinical framework that is actually helpful. Those judgments are helpful for a diagnosis. A lot of the judgments that we do about ourselves and about other people are often very harsh and kind of negative in many respects, and are not very helpful or constructive in any regard.
Well, no, yeah, because they're like putting someone down.
It's like putting somebody down, and that seems to me detrimental form of judgment. I mean, the way we speak to ourselves, sometimes we're incredibly harsh and critical towards ourselves, which only leads to more misery and low self-esteem, low self-worth. So those negative judgments can be outer-directed, externalized, extroverted in some sense, projected onto others, or that they can be same quality of mind can be turned around and directed towards ourselves.
So that can be a mirror of something we're recognizing or projecting.
It can be a mirror of something that we're projecting inside of our, from ourselves onto others. But it can also be, those negative judgments can come from deep-seated beliefs and attitudes as well, deep-seated conditioned beliefs that are not also not necessarily helpful.
Yeah. And when a conflict arises between couples or people in nations, does this then give us the chance to see things that we're actually judging ourselves harshly for, and thus an opportunity to remove these self-limiting beliefs? So we can pull out something positive from conflict in that sense.
I think wherever there's conflict, whether it's and stress and tension, whether it's with relationships or nation states or organizations, it's always important from my side to kind of look at myself and look at what's going on my side of the street, if you like, so that I can take responsibility for those thoughts and behaviours and limiting beliefs that may get in the way, that create disharmony, that create tension and stress. So what is my contribution? I want to be self-reflective to the capacity that I can be mindful of what my contribution might be towards that conflict. And I feel that that's a consciousness-raising project. That's very much part of my sort of work and my I want to understand my side of the street, so to speak, and keep my side of the communication as open as possible, as clean as possible, from that compassionate, non-violent communication. Spirit, so yeah, there is that sense of reflecting deeply within that context of distress or disharmony or conflict.
And could you just elaborate a bit on what is non-violent communication?
Non-violent communication, Marshall Rosenberg was a wonderful psychologist who first developed non-violent communication. He later on called it compassionate communication. And he had a lot to do with the social activist movement, so that his work, nonviolent communication, became well used in nonviolent action protests and also in couples relationship issues. So his work became foundational in many respects. He has a beautiful website. He put huge amount of resources on his website that's freely available for people in terms of what is clear, open, clean, whole communication, he calls it. And it's a really beautiful, simple, step-by-step way of interacting with another human being when there's stress and conflict, and how to do that well. So an art form.
Yeah, because otherwise if you're going to people can put walls up and then it blocks the communication. So I've watched a few videos of his and it talks about explaining how you feel and what you observed rather than...
Yeah, what you observe, then that goes into what are you thinking about that situation, then what are you feeling about that, and then what are you needing? And then how can you ask and request that from that place of knowing what you're needing in that situation, and empathy around what's happening for the other person that you're in relationship with. So it's a beautiful, simple form of communication, style of communication that is really helpful when there's conflict or tension or stress.
So I guess this is not only good for a couple, but also, say, between the environmental community and BP sort of thing.
Yes.
The oil companies.
That's right. It's very helpful if there can be that kind of strategic questioning or nonviolent communication. And then you're not coming from a defensive kind of attack or defended position, but a more open, responsive kind of being clear about what it is that you really feel and think. Yeah. And what?
I'm just going to check. Just say something. Oh, yeah, that's fine. Because this leads perfectly into the next question. Is something I've noticed amongst the green movement is a lot of anger directed towards, say, from where I live, loggers, corporate executives by some environmentalists. Is this anger useful, or is the anger a hindrance to change because it upsets people, creates conflict, and then further environmental damage is done in spite? And how can we remedy this? I guess non-violent communication is that.
I think this is a really, really interesting question, and I think anger does have a role to play initially in any kind of, where there's been a violation of rights or exploitation of the environment. Anger is, my experience is that when I first saw, for example, images of the Franklin River many, many years ago, and I saw this incredibly beautiful movie and images of that river, and the proposal for the Hydroelectric Commission to dam that river, I became really angry. How dare they? How can they do this? How could people kind of dam that wild river when it's heritage listed, World Heritage listed kind of river? And so that anger was a motivating force initially that got me from the northern rivers right down to Tasmania to be on the front line, to be in a non-violent action protest, to being the upriver camp coordinator based at the river for over a month, leading those kind of meetings. So anger, yes, has an important role in, it gets our attention. Anger also, though, cannot be the emotion that continues to motivate one to take constructive action. Because if one just stays in that angry phase, then there's very much a them and an us kind of divide, and this doesn't go down very well. It creates more of a problem, both personally and for the particular project or particular environmental issue that you're trying to deal with. So anger has to be transformed. And my view is that anger, though, is important information. It's just information. It's telling you that something's not right. There's an injustice done, and anger is a call to action. And if you look inside and what's underneath anger, there's some deeper emotions underneath anger, and I find that anger tells me what I really, really care about, what I really value, what I really love, in fact, that has been threatened or violated. And so if we can get down underneath the anger and find that, you know, what it is that's so important to us here, and we speak from that place or act from that place, then there's a whole different sense of empowerment that one can act from, not from a them and an us divide, but from something that we deeply care about, that matters, that's important, what we value. So anger is a catalyst, can be an initiator, but I noticed a lot of social activists and environmental friends of mine too, who are very well-meaning but get very stuck in that kind of angry, righteous angry kind of place.
Yeah, I've noticed that too with the log, because it's mainly logging where we are, and I know some particular guy who every time the log truck, he's got a shop there, walk out of the shop and stick his finger up at truck, and the truck drivers just do it back, and then they get angry, and then the walls go up, and then they're not going to listen, and it doesn't really ultimately do any good.
No, it doesn't. It just creates more and more of a division, more alienation, and there's no discourse and there's no conversation. There's no sort of trying to have a collaborative approach or being able to sit on, you know, yes, opposing sides, but let's look at the problem in the middle, not rather than make the person the problem. Let's attack the issue, and let's come from a place that we deeply care about, that the logger also deeply cares about his job and family and children and his livelihood. So can we come from a deeper place in there that's much more responsive, that's much more respectful, that really enters into a dialogue?
Yeah, Stuart Hill talked about, exactly how he explained it at the moment, I've used it, I've already started editing it in, but about instead of the us and them, about the we.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So anger in the Buddhist tradition can be transformed. Yes, it is considered a hindrance if we kind of stay stuck with that, and but it can be transformed into constructive determination, it said. Determination for the good, determination for clear, wise action. So when we think about it like that, it does need to be, there's responsibility we have for our own emotional life inside, and so that we don't just keep acting out the anger. Yeah. Just acting out the anger creates more and more suffering.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's what's the old saying, like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
Okay.
It's like, no, that doesn't work.
Yeah. I'm just going to move, usually when I'm on my own, I move the camera around a bit, just to play around with the angles. Cool. And next question, what is mindfulness and how can it help people and ultimately humanity treat each other and the earth in a more sustainable way?
It's a beautiful question. Mindfulness is a very beautiful quality that we all have a certain degree of mindfulness and awareness, but we can cultivate that even to a final level. There can be mindfulness of which is outer directed in towards our behaviour and actions and the way we relate to other beings and to our colleagues and work environment and the environment, or that mindfulness can be inner directed towards understanding and being aware of our thoughts, feelings, ideas, felt sense in the body, our whole inner territory, the inner landscape of the human heart and mind. And so we learn through mindfulness that we can actually stand steady and be present to our unfolding experience and be open and responsive to that, rather than in a sort of unconscious kind of patterns where we might have painful feelings or thoughts come up. And if we're not mindful, we tend to react out from those painful thoughts and attitudes or that deep-seated conditioning. And so with mindfulness, it allows us to observe life from a place of relaxation, awareness, centeredness, equanimity. So we've got more of an ability to not just that knee-jerk reaction, but also it offers that pause gap moment between stimulus and response. If we're mindful, we've got that pause where we can actually choose to how we respond rather than just react. Mindfulness also helps, there's been a lot of studies and research done with mindfulness and the benefits of mindfulness these days, and so mindfulness also helps with emotional regulation, believe it or not. So that the more mindful we are of our inner responses and feelings in the moment as we go through our daily life, then we've got an opportunity to also be able to regulate those emotions. Wisely self-soothe at times, our anxieties or fears, interrupt a sort of angry reactivity. So mindfulness is the basis for emotional intelligence. It's one of the cornerstones for self-reflective capacity of mind, actually breeds emotional intelligence. So then that allows us to be much more responsive and open and engaged with the environment, with our friends, with family, if we practice and take on board those practices that cultivate a mindful way of living.
Yeah, and it can help us. I was listening to like a podcast that it was a discussion amongst a few scientists and psychologists and doctors that can help with depression and what they're calling it, neuroplasticity.
Yes, that's a...
Because I put people in it, was like, because I think it was an MRI and showing that people were practicing that mindful meditation sort of thing, how it was changing parts of the brain and having rewire sort of thing. And
exactly.
we can do this to you know, it's not something for young, but the neuroplasticity works at whatever age you're at, you can change.
Yes, that's right. There's been a lot of work done by Dr. Rick Hansen, who is a neuropsychologist who's written a number of books. His first book, called Buddha's Brain, was very much about how we can rewire our brain because of the plasticity of the brain. We can rewire that in terms of away from the negative bias, which is a deep conditioning and default patterns, to the negative bias. And there's ancient survival evolutionary reasons why that is so. But sometimes we can just get into automatic kind of default negative, which contributes to anxiety and depression, increases anxiety and depression. So there is an opportunity, though, with positive neuroplasticity training, that you can rewire for happiness and well-being. And there's beautiful, beautiful courses these days that, based on mindfulness practice, that we can do that really enhance a sense of flourishing rather than getting stuck in the negative script.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think he was on the, because I couldn't catch all the names of it, but I think I heard one of them mention Buddha's Brain, so I think he might have been amongst the panel. Was he American?
Yes,
Yeah,
and
he was one of the panels.
he comes here every year, and I did 6 days of training with Dr. Rick Hansen.
Yeah.
I've done a number of workshops and training with him. He's beautiful, beautiful man, intelligent, wise, very funny, brilliant speaker, very, very clear in his explanation and how to step by step rewire for happiness. And there's a lovely practices that start with taking in the good. And he talks about how oftentimes we screen out the good things and focus in on the one negative thing or the one fault that we did that day. And the brain will sort of hone in on that, and how we can learn to reorganize, refocus, rewire the brain to focusing in on taking in the good things that often go unnoticed and we just take them for granted.
Yeah.
So how to kind of savor that, install that, to deepen into that experience actually starts to change that patterning in the brain, so that we actually then start to feel greater sense of joy coming out of taking in the good. We notice more of those experiences through the day, and we can savor them, so that it starts to change at a cellular level in our brain.
And is this what, like, where gratitude would come in?
Yeah.
How important
Yeah.
gratitude is? Could maybe talk a little bit about gratitude?
Gratitude is really, really important in the Buddhist tradition too, and Rick Hansen talks about this as well, that sense of gratitude for what we have rather than focusing on what we don't have. If we wake up in the morning and we can focus on all of the things that we do have in our lives, you know, a roof over our head, food, a shelter, friends, a network, possibly a good job or an income, all of the things that we probably in some ways also take for granted, that we live in a country, we are blessed, absolutely blessed here in Australia. It's an amazing place, really. We're not at war, we're not, we have social security services.
You have medical if you need an operation and stuff.
We have medical and health and well-being, and so there's many, many wonderful qualities that we have here in Australia, and aspects and in our society. And so really reflecting on those and reflecting on our network of connection really enhances a sense of well-being and being grateful for what we have, even the simple things in life.
Yeah.
The fact that we can walk or talk, or we have the capacity to educate ourselves. So all of these things we can focus on, and it enhances the heart in sense of contentment, satisfaction, well-being. And it reminds me of when I spent time with Uncle Max Harrison, Dumunman, Aboriginal elder who lives down the south coast. Uncle Max, we call him. Wonderful man, and he has this practice of gratitude practice that we did early in the mornings down on the beach, and he would take us down and just sunrise, and we'd stand in a circle and then have gratitude for the sun, and gratitude for Mother Earth, and gratitude for the great ocean and Sister Moon, and so on, and the great forests. And we would just continually name various elements in nature, and this would go on for quite a while in terms of naming all of those things that we have around us, and feel the great gratitude and that sense of interconnectedness with the great nature.
And why is self-compassion important, especially for those who were abused as children, so we stop blaming ourselves for what happened, or self-empathy as well?
Well, there's a strong relationship between empathy and compassion. In fact, empathy leads into compassion. Empathy is about sort of really being able to walk in another person's shoes in some sense, to know, well, what is that like? To imagine even what that history, that person is feeling. Politicians can have empathy too for people in sort of who are in need of housing, so that they can imagine what that person's life might be like. So that's an empathy, being able to kind of use the mind to create an understanding of how it could be for another. Compassion is a complex emotion. It's empathy plus generosity and plus a sense of feeling with. Compassion means com means with, and passion, it means feeling with the suffering of another. And from the Buddhist terminology, the Pali word, the Buddhist word, the ancient Pali word for compassion is karuna, which has a beautiful translation. One of the translations is it's a quivering in the heart in response to another being's pain. So that quivering in the heart is actually a felt sense. It's like you really feel deeply for the pain of another, and there is a response to that pain, you know, in a wish and an intention to alleviate that suffering. So compassion is an extension of empathy into to an action as well. Self-compassion, there's many dimensions of compassion, and I really think that self-compassion is a very, very important quality in learning how to, with mindfulness, be able to attend to those vulnerable, tender places of our inner life, the painful areas, particularly if there's been abuse or difficult childhood or many painful issues, whether it's in a relationship breakup or loss of dear friend or a grief, to be able to learn to self-soothe and hold oneself dear, to hold oneself in a loving kindness and embrace of compassion for the pain that we feel. And with mindfulness plus compassion is a powerful kind of crucible or container for our inner life that creates transformation and healing and soothing of the painful feelings. And so it's a very bodily felt sense when we really attend and befriend. I think that's my motto, is attend and befriend those directly into the wound. It's almost like applying the healing medicine inside, directly in that felt sense. So that's not about suppressing painful things, and it's not about denying or pushing away, and it's not falling in the well of the pain either and being overwhelmed further by that. No, mindfulness and compassion gives you that steady ability to stay present, to attend and befriend those painful things. And when we do that, it starts to subside, it changes, it becomes transformed in a kind of radical acceptance. That is truly healing and truly transformative. Coming back to the abuse in childhood, often when children have been abused, and we've seen so much of this in the Royal Commission lately, and child sexual abuse is very topical, and I specialised in working with child sexual abuse victims and recovery from trauma for many, many years in psychotherapy practice. And so you can see how children, through abuse, through the nature of abuse, really internalise that they are bad or that something's wrong with them. And so the cutting or abusive kind of self-abuse, if you like, can be really, certainly self-compassion can really be very helpful as a technique, if you like, and a very supportive practice that helps the person recover from trauma and dealing with those very painful kind of places.
Next question. What is self-love and how do we obtain it? And why is understanding the oneness of everything, of seeing ourselves and others, an important aspect of self-love?
I think there's, as I like to respond to the part of the sense of oneness and interconnectedness, and then tie in this sense of self-love and how that fits in that kind of picture there. And I think that deep experience of oneness and interconnectedness is a very powerful insight that helps to open the mind to a sense of a wider sense of who we are, really, broader sense of who we are, that we are interconnected with the trees and the great earth and the mountains and rivers and stones and clouds and all beings. And so most people live in a kind of, in the shell of the ego world, where there's quite a sense of separation between self and others. There's a dominant experience is like, I am here and the world is out there. And there's this subject-object duality. And the Buddha said this subject-object duality of that ordinary kind of consciousness is really the main source of suffering. It's one of the deep-seated kind of conditioned viewpoints that actually creates suffering, alienation, and that separation. Yeah? So when we, inquire deeply into, well, who are we really? And we can start to open the mind to experiencing the trees and the birds and the dog and the wind in the trees right now, and the sound of the bird as none other than our very self. This is the interconnected self, the self with a capital S, great self, great earth, as one body, one mind, so to speak. And this is not just a philosophical, poetic kind of saying.
It's science in many ways.
It's both scientific, but it's deeply experiential. And that changes when we feel that we're not, the forests are our very own lungs. The rivers are like our veins through our very own body, that we sense this great sense of connection with the great earth. Then this changes our relationship to the earth as one of stewardship and care and respect for our environment, because we don't see it as separate from ourselves. In fact, our well-being depends on, the well-being of the environment and the sustainability of the environment around us. And so that deep sense of interconnectedness allows for wise and compassionate action that comes out of that space. That you naturally just don't want to chop down that forest. You want to protect it because it's part of you.
Yeah.
And we depend on that. And so do generations to come, and so on. So that there's then that sense of deep interconnectedness is foundational. Yeah? How that relates to self-love is that my sense is that it's both self-love and love with it's the best boundless sense of love. Yeah. So when that sense of separation falls away between self and other, we no longer experience that sense of duality, then there is also no fear. The fear drops away. And when there's no fear, there is just love. What's present when there's no fear is just a sense of openness and respect and kindness, appreciation, gratitude, love. And so that presence of love becomes really a product of open mind, of an inquiring mind, of seeing our interconnected oneness, seeing our vast nature, our timeless nature. And then love is born with wisdom out of that space. So self-love is also, I think, very, very important these days, because it's like so many people suffer from low self-esteem, low self-worth, huge sense of inadequacy, and it's just like a common disease through our society.
Yeah, so is self-esteem very much linked to self-love?
Yeah, it's the low self-esteem is linked to lack of self-love. In fact, there's this lovely story of His Holiness the Dalai Lama that I'll share with you. He was conducting a Buddhist teachers meeting in Delhi with a whole lot of Western senior Dharma teachers who were present. And so His Holiness was asking these senior Western Dharma teachers to report about what was the practice like and what was happening in the West. And a lot of the teachers reported that a lot of the students had low self-esteem. And so His Holiness, after a while, kept hearing this kind of low self-esteem, low self-worth, and he just had no idea what this was. They don't even have a language, there's not even a word for low self-esteem in Tibetan culture. So he kept saying, went round the room, first of all he asked these Dharma teachers, do you suffer from low self-esteem? Do you suffer from low self-esteem? And yes, each person sort of nodded and said, yes, Your Holiness, I have suffered at times from that. I understand what that is. And eventually, His Holiness said, this low self-esteem is a lack of self-love, is a lack of self-compassion, lack of compassion for oneself. And that was his summary. And I thought, oh, it's so brilliant, it's like absolutely true. And, so we're often so harsh and, with ourselves, we're often that harsh inner critical voice is often so dominant when there is low self-esteem. It's like we're so often attuned to that critical voice, as if somehow it's true and correct and real. But actually it's just the critic. It's just a very conditioned, deep-seated attitude of listening to that voice. And so we have a choice, really. We can train ourselves, we can either, because if we keep listening to that critical voice, we start to realize that there's no other outcome. We're going to feel miserable and not okay. That's the outcome, and it happens every single time. Listen to the critical voice, it equals misery. Low self-esteem, low self-worth. So we have a choice. With mindfulness, we have a choice to either listen to a more constructive, wiser, kinder, compassionate, supportive voice, or we can listen to the critic. We can choose. And so listening to the kind of kinder, loving kindness, the voice of loving kindness, and there's many, many practices that then can enhance that. And yes, it's a training. It's the art and training of being kind, understanding, affectionate towards yourself, as if you were your own best friend, which you are. You can be.
How do we raise people's self-esteem without over-inflating the ego? Or people with, or do people who have an overinflated ego or who are narcissists? Is it actually a low self-esteem driving that? A lot of people say they have too much esteem, but it seems to me it would be...
Yes, there's a healthy sense of narcissism which we all need to, in life. But a narcissistic personality or over-narcissistic kind of person is in fact underneath that, because they have an inflated sense of self, which is not a healthy sense of self. Yeah, inflated sense of self and grandiose and self-importance is not a healthy relationship to oneself. And in fact, often underneath, you're quite right, there's often underneath that is a sense of inadequacy and low self-esteem. And that's all too painful to go there, so that they inflate grandiose kind of sense of self-importance. And so it's all on this spectrum of ego in one sense. Narcissism and an inflated sense of self, and where often they put down other people, is kind of ego at one level. And a low self-esteem is also a negative sense of self, is also on the other end of the spectrum of low self-esteem. It's on the same spectrum of ego, in a way.
Yeah. Next question. It is said that those who choose to live well must help others to live well, for the value of a life is measured by the lives it touches. And that those who choose happiness must help others to find happiness, because the welfare of each is bound up in the welfare of all. How and why is it that the welfare of each is bound up in the welfare of all?
Well, it's because we are interconnected. There's a seamless totality in the universe. There's from the sort of the universe as a whole is 13.7 billion years old, I think. And so we are one whole organism in that sense. So the welfare of others, because of their interconnectedness, is also, affects our welfare. If other person is suffering and impoverished and having a very difficult time, and then in many ways that it impacts on us as well. Yeah? We don't live in a cocoon. We don't live on an island, in one sense. Yeah. And so this sense of when we really feel and open the mind and open the heart, we've recognized that other people's happiness also becomes our happiness. One of the ways to gain a lot of happiness, in some sense, is to focus on others' well-being. They say the happiest people alive and are people who actually care and focus on other people's well-being and happiness. Because when we focus on other people's happiness and joy and their flourishing, as well as our own, but when we also include others, then we're always happy because there's always somebody else who's also happy. So there's a rebound kind of effect there. So then we're cultivating happiness for self and other, and other people's happiness gives us great joy and great pleasure to see their happiness and well-being and their flourishing.
Yeah.
So that sense of it's circular. It's like circulating the gift. Keeps circulating around.
Yeah. Much of what we've talked about today is written as wisdom in the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, and Buddhist scriptures. Yet it has, by very example of the madness of the world, not been fully appreciated or lived by. Why do you think this is so, and why are people so afraid of what I would call self-responsible spirituality?
Well, I had to laugh at that question too, because I thought, yes, it's so true. There's the benefits of religion. A lot of institutionalized religion has also caused enormous amount of suffering, wars, abuse. There's difficulties that's come out of those same institutions that have been proponents of good and ethical kind of living. So, I think it is very difficult to take on board, as you said, self-responsible spirituality. And because it's hard work, right? It's very difficult and it's challenging to be fully responsible, to show up, to be fully responsible, to wake up and show up and be fully responsible for our thinking, feeling and behavior, for our actions in the world, for our life circumstance and so on. It's like a lot of people don't want to do that. They'd rather pass the buck or blame other people or live in a cocooned kind of society. And all of those kind of prejudices that come with that. And so fundamentalist kind of religious beliefs or rigid beliefs and ideologies that fit into that category, I feel are really detrimental, incredibly detrimental to the individuals within those organizations, and also have a very negative impact towards others as well, because it creates division, there's prejudice and judgment, and the sense of kind of being the one only righteous way. All those kind of impacts are very negative impacts. So one of the things that I like about Buddhism is that front and central to the Buddhist religion, and if you could call it, some people call it a religion, some people call it a psychology, some people call it an ethical way of life, some people call it a philosophy. But central to it is taking responsibility, which is the Buddha called right effort. That it's not about having a set of beliefs, but about also taking on board that responsibility to wake up in one's life for your own liberation. Work towards your own liberation and the liberation of others. Now, that's work. He did mean it. It's work. And we can't shy away from that. And it's deep inner work to face our deep-seated conditioning. And we take vows in the Zen tradition regularly, the Bodhisattva vows. And one of the lines of the Bodhisattva vow is, greed, hatred and delusion rise endlessly. I vow to abandon them. And so there's that deep-seated conditioning that we have, and we can see in our own lives, for me it's like pay attention to those times where I am caught up in negativity, or that I am consumed with craving or desires. All of those things create a degree of suffering. So I need to attend to that. And that takes work. A lot of inner work. Patience, perseverance, it takes practice, a training ground. Encouragement, support, and sangha and community and like-minded friends and companions who are walking the path. We need all of the support that we can get, because in many ways to wake up and show up and take responsibility for the mess that we created too in this world is in some sense going against the stream of our culture. Our culture is consumed by materialistic endeavours of gaining and acquiring and all manner of things, and it's kind of headed down a certain track in our society, economically and politically and socially and so on. And so to do the inner work that requires is actually, in some sense, going against the stream. And we need support for that.
Yeah, totally. The meek shall inherit the earth is an ancient prophecy, or a wise logical conclusion. Yet to be meek, to be humble, to be compassionate, the things we've spoken about today, to be vulnerable, are all seen as weaknesses. How and why are these things actually the strongest emotional, psychological, peaceful, loving, empowering place we can obtain as human beings, rather than being weak?
A lot of people do view, unfortunately, humility, compassion, the vulnerability as qualities of weakness, but I see them as qualities of strength, in fact. Because compassion, the virtues of compassion and vulnerability and humility come from a heart and mind that is open and responsive and connected. They don't come from a place of a dominating, controlling, fear-based mind that is exploitative or abusive. So we desperately need more compassionate, mindful leaders. We need more compassionate, these qualities of humility and and compassion and care and respect for one another and for the planet. These are the qualities that are going to take us forward. Seems to me that it's a no-brainer, but it's like.
Do you think the meek will inherit the earth, and do you think that there's a lot of wisdom in that quote?
There is a lot of wisdom in that quote, but I guess I don't quite see it in perhaps a kind of very literalist way. When we are meek and humble, and we are not our ego is not driven by self-importance and dominance over the earth. When we are in that sense of kind of openness and humility with the great nature, and in fact in awe of it, and with that sense of amazement, then that sense of meekness, if you like, in that moment and in that experience, we inherit the earth because we feel we are connected and blessed. Yeah. The bird song sings in my own heart. That's what I mean by inheriting the earth right here, right now. Yeah. We feel that deep sense of connectedness with the mountains and rivers. And so on a very literal and practical sense, the meek don't inherit the earth at all, in one sense. Do you know what I mean?
Not at the moment.
Not at the moment, and possibly never. In a kind of, the people who inherit the earth at this moment are big corporations, and in some ways exploitative corporations.
Psychopaths, the rich, greedy narcissists.
So on. And so there's on a very pragmatic, literal kind of practical level, I would say that those people inherit the earth. But on a spiritual and a very heartfelt sense, and like I said, the deep sense of interconnectedness, then in those experiences, our heart is not separate from the earth. And in that way, we inherit the blessings of the earth.
After making all these docos, I try and stay positive with the way the world's going. It's just, yeah. And the more and more I learn, all the professors and doctors and lawyers and things that I've interviewed now, and I know from so many different angles, it's hard to stay positive, but we've got to keep fighting the good fight, I guess.
Yes, and John Seed and I have talked about this too, and a lot of social activists or environmental activists, how to stay positive when things are looking, when the time is past midnight, and in fact, you know, it has, and we're on a path that's kind of the degradation of the rainforests and our planet, and the poisons in the rivers and the oceans and the atmosphere and so on. And we're not going down a wise track here.
Yeah, we haven't changed course at all. Really.
No, and it's going to lead to a lot more suffering yet. But when I think about that, and all the good people and all the good actions, and you know, that of people trying so hard to turn that around and to a much more sustainable future for our children and for the planet, even with all of that, even if it doesn't work out, even if it, let's say we don't, you know, goes down the wrong track, and it's more of the same in a way that's unsustainable. What do we do? I've asked myself that question. In the face of despair and even, you know, okay, what do I do? Do I just sit there and give up? No.
No.
There is no choice. From my point of view, from where I sit, even if we fail, even if all that good work is to no avail, there is no other choice, I feel.
Yeah.
I will continue to do and speak out and do what I can.
Yeah. Let's say I'm not going down without a fight.
Not going down without a fight, and regardless of outcome, I think it's what's really important is that we hold true to that vision, even if that fails and we don't succeed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's any point in falling into despair. That is not going to save us either.
Yeah, correct.
And so I'd rather stay with the open possibility of creative change, even if it means possibly the kind of life as we know it, and all of the kind of wonderful things about human culture, even if that goes down the drain. And I would rather stay with the kind of creative potential and possibilities and keep an open mind than be sort of have my mind kind of, I suppose, sitting in despair.
Yeah.